Picture this. I'm settled on my porch, cradling a steaming mug of coffee, the lake shimmering under the morning sun, promising a peaceful start to the day. Then, like a storm cloud in heels, Miranda Blackwood marches up, clutching a blood red notice that might as well have been a guillotine. "You've got 48 hours to vacate," she barks, her navy blazer crisp as her tone. "Vacate my lake cabin, the one my grandfather poured his heart into, left to me as a sanctuary." Apparently, the Lakeside Estates HOA, newly crowned and power-hungry, thinks they can just evict me. But this wasn't just a notice, it was a battle cry. Behind Miranda's flawless hair and her precious HOA rulebook lurked something darker, a web of legal traps, trumped-up violations, and outright sabotage. I wasn't just fighting for my cabin, I was about to unravel a scheme threatening to steal the entire lake. Have you ever faced an HOA tyrant like Miranda? Drop your story in the comments. I know I'm not the only one tangled in this mess. Which city in the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any run-ins with an HOA. We'll narrate your story on our channel. My morning had begun like every other at my cozy lakeside cabin, a place I called home for 3 years since inheriting it from my grandfather. I'm a freelance archaeological surveyor, working from a home office in this 1987 cedar-sided retreat, complete with a wraparound porch that groans with character. It's not fancy, but it's mine, quiet, comforting, and steeped in memories. That is, until Miranda Blackwood swept into the neighborhood 2 years ago, anointing herself the queen of everything within a 5-mile radius. There she stood on my porch, dressed like she'd just stepped out of a corporate boardroom, blonde hair sculpted to perfection, makeup flawless, nails gleaming like tiny daggers. Waving that red notice like a war flag, she declared, "This property violates the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association standards. It's an eyesore, lacks permits, and it's dragging down property values." Each word landed like a punch. My vision blurred, a cold dread creeping up my spine, dragging me back to when I was 12, watching bureaucrats force my family off our land over some legal loophole. My hands shook so hard I nearly dropped my coffee mug, the ceramic clinking against the porch railing, a tiny chip breaking off like a piece of my world falling apart. "Mom," I stammered, voice barely holding. "I have all the inheritance papers. My grandfather left me this cabin fair and square." Miranda's laugh cut through the air, sharp and cold. "Sweetheart, old deeds don't override new rules. The HOA was established 18 months ago. Every property here answers to us. Your little shack either gets a facelift to meet our standards or it's gone. You've got 48 hours to comply, or we'll see you in court." She thrust the red paper at me like she was serving a death warrant. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the document, and I felt like that terrified child again, helpless in the face of official authority. Just as I was about to retreat into my cabin like the scared kid, I apparently still was inside. A familiar voice called out from across the yard. "Morning, Miss Miranda. Beautiful day for neighborhood surveillance, isn't it?" We both turned to see Eugene Gable, my 72-year-old neighbor, standing on his porch with what appeared to be a professional-grade camera. Eugene had been documenting neighborhood activities for years, ever since his own run-in with a previous HOA attempt had taught him the value of evidence. He'd always said that the best defense against bullies was a good recording, and he'd made it his mission to keep an eye on everyone and everything that happened around the lake. Miranda's perfectly controlled expression flickered with irritation. "You can't record me without my permission, you old man," she snapped. Eugene just smiled and adjusted his camera settings. "Actually, miss, you're on his property making legal threats. Pretty sure that makes it a matter of public interest." Miranda's eyes narrowed as she calculated her next move. She looked between Eugene and me like she was playing chess, and we'd just made an unexpected move. "This isn't over, Langston," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. 48 hours. I suggest you use them wisely." She turned and walked back toward her oversized house, her heels clicking against the pavement with military precision. I stood there holding the eviction, notice my coffee growing cold and my hands still trembling. Eugene walked over, still carrying his camera. "Son," he said quietly, "I've been keeping an eye on that woman for months. She's been planning something like this since the day she moved in. You're going to need help, and you're going to need evidence." The rest of the day passed in a haze of panic and desperate phone calls. I tried to focus on my work. I had a geological survey due for a property development company in the next county, but every time I looked at that red paper sitting on my kitchen table, my concentration evaporated completely. The eviction notice was filled with legal terminology that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Terms like architectural covenants, community standards compliance, and mandatory remediation procedures swam around my brain like alphabet soup. I found myself pacing the length of my cabin, wearing a groove in the hardwood floors while consuming enough coffee to fuel a small aircraft. By evening, I'd accomplished absolutely nothing except confirming that I was still the same frightened person I'd been at 12 years old. As the sun set over the lake, casting everything in shades of gold and amber that usually brought me peace, all I could think about was that red paper and the 48-hour deadline that was already counting down like a time bomb. I sat on my porch watching the water lap against the shore and wondered if this was how it was going to end, not with some dramatic battle, but with me simply giving up because I was too scared to fight. The thought of losing my grandfather's cabin felt like betraying everything he'd worked for. But the alternative, facing down Miranda and her legal machinery, seemed impossible for someone like me. Rick Palmer drove by in his pickup truck, slowing down as he passed my driveway. He'd lived in the big house on Maple Street for about 8 years, and we'd exchanged pleasantries at neighborhood gatherings, but I'd never really gotten to know him. Tonight, though, he stopped and rolled down his window, looking like he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure how to start. The next morning, Eugene appeared at my door before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, carrying a manila folder that looked like it contained enough evidence to convict someone of something serious. "Sawyer, my boy," he said, settling into one of my porch chairs with the air of someone who'd been waiting for this conversation for months. "We need to talk about our mutual Miranda problem. What I've discovered is going to change everything you think you know about this situation." It turned out that Eugene's neighborhood surveillance wasn't just casual curiosity. It was the result of his own bitter encounter with HOA overreach 3 years earlier, when a previous group had tried to force him to remove his deceased wife's memorial garden. "I've been documenting Miranda's activities since the day she moved in," Eugene explained, his voice carrying the weight of months of careful observation. "She didn't just move here and decide to start an HOA. She specifically targeted this neighborhood after researching properties with potential legal vulnerabilities, older structures, unclear boundaries, elderly owners who might be susceptible to legal pressure. Your cabin was marked as a primary target because of its age and what she perceived as exploitable property issues in the county records. The evidence he'd gathered painted a picture of systematic predatory behavior designed to acquire valuable lakefront property through legal intimidation rather than legitimate community improvement. Eugene had obtained documents through Freedom of information requests that revealed Miranda's extensive pre-purchase research of our area. She had been conducting property assessments throughout the neighborhood for months, measuring distances, photographing structures, and meeting with people who appeared to be contractors or real estate professionals. "This isn't community improvement," Eugene said grimly. "This is property acquisition through bureaucratic warfare, and you're just the first target in a much larger plan." After Eugene left to continue his intelligence gathering, I called Tom Stevens to discuss the implications of what we discovered. Tom's initial reaction was professional skepticism, but as I described Eugene's findings, his tone became increasingly serious. "Sawyer," he said, "if this is accurate, then Miranda isn't just harassing you, she's running what amounts to a property acquisition scheme using HOA authority as cover. The good news is that your cabin predates any HOA jurisdiction by decades. The bad news is that she's been working multiple angles through various county departments to create legal pressure, regardless of HOA legitimacy." Tom explained that Miranda had filed complaints with environmental agencies, building departments, and planning commissions, creating a web of bureaucratic challenges designed to overwhelm me with legal costs and administrative procedures. "The strategy appears to be forcing you into a position where selling becomes easier than fighting," he said. "It's sophisticated, expensive, and unfortunately often effective against property owners who can't afford extended legal battles." He outlined potential defense strategies, but warned that Miranda's approach suggested she had significant resources and was prepared for a prolonged campaign. Just as Tom was explaining the various legal challenges I was facing, my phone rang with a call from Miranda herself. Tom advised me to take it on speaker so he could hear the conversation. Miranda's voice was sickeningly sweet when I answered, like poisoned honey. "De Langston," she said, "I wanted to personally inform you that I've just finished meeting with county planning officials about your situation. They've agreed to expedite your compliance review due to the serious nature of the alleged violations. You should be receiving additional documentation shortly, and I wanted to ensure you understood the accelerated timeline we're working with." Before I could respond, she'd hung up, leaving me staring at my phone like it had just delivered a death sentence. Tom was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "That call was a serious mistake on her part," he said finally. "She just admitted to having private meetings with county officials about your case before any formal proceedings have begun. That suggests either improper influence or outright corruption, and either way, it's something we can potentially use in your defense." Within 2 hours of Miranda's call, a convoy of official vehicles descended on my property like I was harboring fugitives. A county building inspector, an environmental assessment team, and a code enforcement officer all arrived simultaneously, each carrying official documents and explaining they'd received urgent reports about potential safety hazards at my address. The lead inspector, Rodriguez, seemed genuinely apologetic as he explained the situation, but they still had to complete their mandated inspections regardless of how frivolous the complaints might appear. The inspection process consumed the entire afternoon and cost me 2 full days of work income. Rodriguez and his team found absolutely nothing wrong. The cabin was structurally sound, environmentally compliant, and built to standards that exceeded current requirements. However, they still had to file comprehensive reports and schedule follow-up visits to satisfy the multiple complaints that had been submitted. Meanwhile, Miranda observed the entire process from her perfectly maintained lawn, her satisfaction obvious even from a distance. The inspections themselves were clearly part of her strategy. She didn't need actual violations, just enough harassment and expense to make me want to give up. That evening, as I sat trying to process the day's events and the implications of what Eugene had discovered, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Rick Palmer from Maple Street. I need to talk to you about your grandfather and Miranda's real plans for this neighborhood. There are things you need to know that nobody else is telling you. Can we meet tomorrow morning?" I stared at the message, wondering if Rick might be offering genuine help or if this was another element of Miranda's campaign. The timing immediately after the inspection circus suggested he'd been monitoring the situation closely. I typed back, "Yes, 8 a.m. at my place," and tried to prepare myself for whatever revelations were coming next. Rick Palmer arrived at exactly 8 the next morning, looking like a man who'd spent the night wrestling with his conscience. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of honest face that made you want to trust him immediately. But after everything with Miranda, I'd learned to be suspicious of everyone in this neighborhood until proven otherwise. He kept glancing toward Miranda's house as he walked up my driveway, clearly conflicted between wanting to help and fearing whatever consequences might come from talking to me. "Before we start," he said, settling nervously into one of my porch chairs, "I need you to know that I never actually supported Miranda's complaint against you. When she came to me with that petition, she told me it was just about establishing basic community standards. I signed it because it seemed reasonable. But after watching what she's really doing to you, I want to help however I can." He pulled out a small notebook filled with his own handwriting, the kind of careful documentation that suggested he'd been thinking about this conversation for weeks. "The thing is," Rick continued, "I knew your grandfather. Harold Langston taught a local history course at the Community College Extension program, and I took his class about 6 years ago when I was new to the area. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. I'd had no idea that my grandfather had continued teaching after retirement, or that any of his former students were still living in the neighborhood." Rick's expression softened as he described my grandfather as someone who brought local history to life through personal stories and detailed knowledge of land development patterns around the lake. "He talked about your family's property quite a bit," Rick said, consulting his notebook. Not in a boastful way, but as an example of how property ownership had evolved in this area over the decades. He mentioned that the original property boundaries were much different from what people assumed, and that many newer developments had been built without proper attention to historical land rights. Rick looked up from his notes, meeting my eyes directly. He specifically said that if anyone ever tried to challenge your family's ownership, the truth would be found in the original documentation, not in modern assumptions about property lines. Before we could delve deeper into my grandfather's teachings, the morning peace was shattered by industrial lawn equipment roaring to life at concert volume levels. I looked toward Miranda's property and saw a landscaping crew setting up enough machinery to clear-cut a national forest. The noise was absolutely incredible. My chainsaws, wood chippers, and some kind of stump grinder that sounded like a jet engine in distress. Rick and I had to shout to be heard over the mechanical symphony of harassment. "She started this yesterday at 6 in the morning," he yelled. "Same routine every day this week." The landscaping assault was clearly just the opening move in what became a comprehensive psychological warfare campaign. Over the next few days, Miranda deployed a calculated strategy of harassment designed to make my life unbearable. Massive floodlights appeared around her property, all strategically positioned to shine directly into my cabin windows throughout the night, making sleep nearly impossible. The combination of early morning noise and nighttime illumination created a perfect storm of sleep deprivation that left me exhausted and increasingly unable to think clearly. But Miranda's most devastating attack came when she somehow managed to sabotage my professional work entirely. I'd been in the middle of an important archaeological survey contract for a development project near the county line. Exactly the kind of steady, well-paying job that kept me financially stable enough to maintain the cabin. Halfway through the project, the developers called to inform me that they'd received anonymous professional complaints, questioning my qualifications and suggesting possible ethical violations in my work. Someone had contacted the state archaeological board, the county planning office, and even my professional insurance company with detailed accusations about my competence and integrity. Clearing my name required 3 days of documentation and administrative procedures that cost me both time and money I couldn't afford to lose. The development company, nervous about potential liability issues, decided to terminate my contract and hire someone else. Miranda had found a way to attack my livelihood without leaving fingerprints on the weapon. The breaking point came when I decided to try reasoning with Miranda directly. I walked over to her house one evening, hoping that maybe we could have an adult conversation and find some kind of compromise. She answered the door wearing cocktail attire at 7 in the evening, as if she'd been expecting guests. Well, she said, with mock surprise, if it isn't our neighborhood's most notorious code violator. What can I do for you, Mr. Langston? I took a deep breath and tried to maintain a calm, reasonable tone. Miranda, I was hoping we could discuss this situation and maybe find a solution that works for everyone. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Exhaustion, maybe, or a flash of genuine vulnerability. You want to know the truth. Sawyer, she said, her voice losing some of its usual edge. I spent 6 months sleeping in my car after my divorce. My ex-husband destroyed everything I'd worked for through legal maneuvers I never saw coming. I swore I'd never let anyone undermine a community I was part of ever again. For a brief moment, I actually felt sympathy for her, understanding that her need for control might come from deep personal trauma, but then her expression hardened again, and the Miranda I'd come to dread was back. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you ruin what I've built here, she continued coldly. Your little cabin and your simple life philosophy don't fit with the vision this neighborhood needs. I suggest you use whatever time you have left to make the smart choice, Mr. Langston. She stepped back and began closing the door, effectively ending our conversation. That night I couldn't sleep at all. Every sound outside made me jump, wondering what new form of harassment Miranda might deploy next. At around 3 in the morning, my phone rang with a call that nearly gave me a heart attack. It was Betty Morrison, my neighbor from across the lake, and she sounded genuinely terrified. Sawyer, she whispered, there was a woman at my door tonight asking about some old map that your grandfather drew for me years ago. She seemed angry. When I told her, I didn't know what she was talking about. My blood went cold as I realized Miranda was now targeting other neighbors in her quest to find something she could use against me. The escalation following Betty's warning call was swift and devastating. Miranda deployed what Tom Stevens called the nuclear option, a formal restraining order request claiming I had engaged in a pattern of threatening and harassing behavior toward her. The legal documents that arrived by certified mail painted me as an unstable individual who had made threatening gestures, used aggressive language, and engaged in stalking behavior by walking past her property. The evidence package included security camera footage of me checking my own mail and tending my yard, all presented as examples of supposedly menacing conduct. The courthouse summons felt like a death sentence in my hands. The moment I saw that official seal, I was 12 years old again, watching suited strangers determine my family's fate through incomprehensible paperwork. My hands shook so violently I had to set the document down before I dropped it. The coffee mug I'd been holding slipped from my trembling fingers and shattered against the floor, ceramic shards and hot liquids spreading across the room like physical manifestations of my crumbling world. I stood there unable to move, paralyzed by the same crushing helplessness I'd felt as a child facing adult bureaucracy. The 6 days before the hearing became a blur of sleepless nights and constant anxiety. I couldn't concentrate on work, couldn't eat regular meals, and found myself checking door locks obsessively while jumping at every unexpected sound. Tom tried to be reassuring, explaining that restraining orders based on such weak evidence rarely succeeded, but his words felt distant compared to the panic consuming my daily existence. The isolation was the worst part. Rick had offered support, but was clearly afraid of becoming Miranda's next target. Eugene's surveillance felt inadequate against her legal machinery, and Betty was too frightened to get involved after her encounter. Miranda seemed to have unlimited resources and connections throughout the local bureaucracy. Every day brought new complications, surprise inspections, permit challenges, mysterious regulatory complaints. Fighting her felt like battling a hydra, where defeating one challenge only caused two more to appear. By the night before the hearing, I had completely fallen apart, unable to sleep or form coherent sentences. When Tom called to review our strategy, I sat by the lake at 2 a.m, seriously considering abandoning everything my grandfather had left me rather than face continued destruction. At the hearing, everything went catastrophically wrong. From the moment I entered that courtroom, the formal atmosphere, judicial procedures, and sight of Miranda sitting calmly with her attorney while I struggled to control my obvious distress created a perfect storm of panic that rendered me nearly speechless. When called to defend myself, my voice shook so badly the judge had to ask me to repeat statements multiple times. My hands trembled visibly as I tried to organize papers, and sweat beaded on my forehead despite the air conditioning. Miranda's attorney presented their case with smooth professional competence, describing me as an unstable individual harassing their client through increasingly aggressive behavior. They painted a picture of a lonely, bitter man who resented his neighbor's success and was acting out through intimidation. When my turn came, I managed only stammering, disjointed responses that probably made me look guilty of something indefinable. Tom did his best to present our evidence, but the damage from my obvious emotional instability had already been done. The judge granted a temporary restraining order pending a full hearing in 30 days. I was legally prohibited from approaching within 100 ft of Miranda's property, meaning I couldn't check my own mailbox, 10 portions of my yard, or sit on certain parts of my own porch without potentially violating court orders. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt completely hollowed out, like someone had surgically removed everything that made me human. Tom kept talking about appeals and additional evidence, but all I could hear was the echo of my own failure. That night, I sat by the lake until sunrise, watching the sky gradually lighten while thinking about my grandfather's strength and dignity in facing life's challenges. He'd built his own business from nothing, raised 5 children during economic hardships, and never seemed to doubt his ability to handle whatever life presented. What would he think of his grandson being defeated by a woman with too much money and not enough conscience? As the sun came up over the water, casting everything in shades of gold and possibility, I made a decision that would change everything. Before surrendering completely, I was going to search through every single document my grandfather had left behind. If there were answers to be found in his papers, I was going to find them, even if it was already too late to save myself. My grandfather had always been the strongest person I knew, someone who never backed down from a fight when something important was at stake. Maybe somewhere in those boxes of family documents, I'd find not just legal ammunition, but the courage he'd always believed I possessed. The basement of my cabin had always been a place I avoided, filled with decades of accumulated family history that felt too overwhelming to face. But with my 30-day deadline approaching and nothing left to lose, I spent the entire next morning hauling box after box of my grandfather's documents up to the main floor. The collection was staggering. Contracts dating back to the 1940s, correspondence with local officials, property tax records, insurance policies, and legal papers that chronicled 60 years of careful documentation. Most of it seemed routine at first glance, but Buried deep in the fourth box, wrapped in an old towel like a treasure, I found something that made my heart stop. It was a metal strong box about the size of a large book, with a combination lock that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A piece of faded masking tape on the lid bore my grandfather's careful handwriting. For Sawyer when the time comes. I sat there on my living room floor, surrounded by decades of family papers, holding this mysterious container and wondering what secrets my grandfather had considered important enough to lock away. The combination mechanism was old-fashioned, requiring 4 numbers, and I had no idea where to even begin guessing what he might have chosen as the code. I tried his birthday without success, then remembered something from his funeral. The pastor had mentioned that my grandfather used to say, the most important day of his life was the day my grandmother died, because that was when he truly understood the depth of love and loss. With trembling fingers, I entered the date of my grandmother's death, month, day, and year, and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the soft click of an old lock finally opening. Inside the strong box was a collection of documents that would completely revolutionize my understanding of my family's history and my current legal situation. The first item was a property deed from 1962 written in formal legal language and bearing official seals that spoke of substantial financial transactions. According to this deed, my grandfather hadn't purchased just the small lot where my cabin now stood. He had bought 52 acres of prime lakefront property, including the cabin site, surrounding forest, vast stretches of undeveloped shoreline, and this was the part that made me dizzy, 65% of the actual lake itself. The legal description was incredibly detailed, including hand-drawn maps, precise survey measurements, and water rights that extended far beyond anything I had ever imagined. According to these documents, Miranda's house, Rick Palmer's property, and at least 7 other homes in the neighborhood were built on land that legally belonged to me. The implications were staggering. Instead of being a vulnerable property, owner facing harassment, I was actually the legitimate owner of most of the neighborhood that had been developed without proper attention to underlying land rights. But the real treasure at the bottom of the strong box was a letter from my grandfather written in his careful handwriting and dated just 2 months before he died. My dear Sawyer, it began, if you're reading this, then someone is probably trying to take our land away from you just like they tried to take it from us when you were young. Don't let them do it, son. This property has been in our family for over 60 years, and every acre of it was bought and paid for according to the law. The documents in this box prove that we own not just the cabin, but most of the land around, the lake that people have been building on without permission. The letter continued with specific legal advice and contact information for attorneys, but the part that affected me most deeply was his personal message. I know you've been afraid of legal fights ever since what happened to us when you were 12, but this is different, Sawyer. This time we have the law on our side, we have the documentation to prove it, and most importantly, you have the strength to see it through. Don't let fear keep you from protecting what's rightfully yours. You're stronger than you know, you have more friends than you realize, and sometimes the people who look the most powerless turn out to be the most dangerous opponents when they're fighting for something that really matters. Tom Stevens' reaction when I showed him the documents was worth documenting for posterity. He sat in complete silence for almost 5 minutes, carefully examining each document with professional attention to detail. Then he started making phone calls to county records offices and title companies to verify authenticity. Finally, when confirmation started coming back positive, he actually laughed out loud. Something I'd never heard him do professionally. Sawyer, he said, spreading the papers across his conference table like a battle plan, this doesn't just change your situation, this changes everything for half the neighborhood. You don't just own your cabin, You own the majority of the developed property around this lake, including significant portions of several other people's houses and yards. Within 3 days, we had complete verification. Every document was authentic, properly filed, and legally binding. The county clerk's office had records dating back to 1962 confirming every detail of my grandfather's transaction. Rick Palmer's reaction when I called him was a combination of shock, embarrassment, and relief.
"I should have known," he said. "Your grandfather was the most honest, thorough man I ever met. What do you need me to do to help make this right?" For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had a real ally who understood what was
truly at stake. But the most important change was internal. I wasn't afraid of legal documents or government officials anymore. I had the truth, the documentation, and finally the courage my grandfather had always believed I possessed. Miranda's decision to go completely public with her campaign against me turned out to be the tactical error that would ultimately destroy her entire operation. She organized what she called an emergency community safety forum, complete with printed invitations, a rented sound system, and personal appeals to local media outlets and county council members. The event was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. on a Saturday evening at the community pavilion with the stated purpose of addressing immediate property violations and neighborhood security concerns. Apparently, my quiet existence in my grandfather's cabin had somehow evolved into a community-wide threat requiring immediate intervention. Tom Stevens and I arrived at the pavilion to find approximately 60 people packed into the space, including many faces I'd never seen before. Miranda had clearly been working her network extensively, bringing in supporters from other neighborhoods and what appeared to be members of various HOA advocacy groups. She'd prepared a comprehensive presentation that portrayed my peaceful cabin as a condemned structure threatening the safety and property values of the entire region through strategic photography and creative manipulation of facts. The presentation was a masterpiece of selective editing designed to make my lakeside retreat look like a dangerous eyesore. Miranda introduced what she called expert testimony from her brother-in-law, who worked for the county parks department, and a family friend with construction experience, neither of whom had any actual authority or legitimate expertise related to my property. But their official-sounding presentations about structural concerns and environmental risks impressive to audience members who lack the background knowledge to evaluate their credibility accurately. The audience appeared completely convinced by Miranda's theatrical performance. People were taking notes, asking questions about protecting their families from the dangers I allegedly represented, and discussing potential legal remedies for what they now perceived as a serious community crisis. I sat there listening to myself being characterized as a neighborhood menace, feeling that familiar childhood panic rising in my chest. And this was exactly the kind of public humiliation that had traumatized my family decades earlier, and I could feel myself starting to shut down emotionally under such overwhelming social pressure. Just as Miranda was building toward her dramatic conclusion about the urgent need for immediate community action, Betty Morrison stood up in the back of the room. She was carrying what appeared to be a rolled document that looked significantly older than most people in the audience, and she had the kind of quietly determined expression that suggested she was about to fundamentally change the conversation's direction. "Excuse me," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the pavilion, "but before anyone makes any decisions, I think everyone needs to see something important that directly relates to this discussion." Betty walked deliberately to the front of the room and carefully unrolled what turned out to be a hand-drawn map of extraordinary detail and obvious craftsmanship. "Sawyer's grandfather created this map for me in 1985, she announced to the now silent audience. Harold Langston was concerned that people might someday build in inappropriate locations around the lake. So he wanted me to understand the actual property boundaries as they were established in the original land purchases. The map depicted the entire lake area with precise measurements and property descriptions that were dramatically different from what everyone had assumed to be true. According to my grandfather's meticulously detailed map, my family's property extended far beyond the cabin site to encompass most of the residential development around the lake. The room fell completely silent as people processed the implications. Miranda's face went through several rapid color changes, and her voice had lost all confidence when she protested. "That's just an old drawing. It doesn't have any legal standing." But Tom Stevens was already on his feet, carrying the metal strongbox containing my grandfather's official documentation. "Actually," Tom said with calm, professional confidence, "it has complete legal standing because it matches perfectly with county land records on file since 1962. He began systematically presenting the official property deed, original survey documents, and legal descriptions that prove my grandfather's map was based on legitimate government records rather than assumptions. The evidence was irrefutable. My family owned 52 acres of lakefront property, including significant portions of several houses that had been built in recent decades. I stood up, and for the first time in months, my voice was steady and completely free of fear. "I don't need to apologize for living peacefully on my own land," I said, looking directly at Miranda before scanning the faces of everyone else in the room. "But there are approximately 8 people here who need to explain why. They've been building houses and landscaping yards on property that has belonged to my family for over 60 years. The reaction was immediate and dramatic, with people pulling out phones to call real estate agents, lawyers, and title insurance companies. The audience began asking increasingly frantic questions about property taxes, title insurance, and legal implications of having built on land they didn't actually own. Rick Palmer stood up and formally apologized, explaining that he'd been manipulated into supporting Miranda's campaign without understanding the true property ownership situation. Even some of Miranda's imported supporters began quietly leaving as they realized they'd been brought in under pretenses. But Miranda wasn't finished. As the meeting devolved into chaos and people demanded answers about their own property rights, she stood up with an expression of pure rage and desperation. "This isn't over."
"Langston," she said, her voice carrying a level of threat that made several people step back. "You think you're clever with your old papers, but you have no idea what I'm capable of when someone tries to destroy everything I've worked to build."
She stormed out of the pavilion, leaving behind her presentation materials and what had clearly been a carefully orchestrated campaign, now lying in complete ruins. As people slowly filed out, many stopped to apologize for their earlier assumptions or ask questions about the historical property boundaries. The local newspaper reporter who'd been documenting the meeting requested a follow-up interview about property rights issues and local history. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was controlling the situation rather than simply reacting to Miranda's harassment. But something about her final threat and the look of desperate fury in her eyes suggested she wasn't prepared to accept defeat, even facing overwhelming legal evidence. Miranda's last desperate attempt to destroy me came at 3:30 on a Tuesday morning. And if Eugene Gable hadn't been suffering from his usual insomnia while monitoring the neighborhood through his bedroom window, she might have actually succeeded in eliminating the evidence that proved my property rights. I was jolted awake by Eugene pounding frantically on my front door and shouting something about trucks and demolition equipment approaching my property under cover of darkness. When I stumbled outside in my pajamas and bare feet, I could see flashlights and vehicle headlights moving around the lakeside of my property, accompanied by the unmistakable sounds of heavy machinery being positioned for what appeared to be an immediate demolition operation. "They're planning to tear down your cabin," Eugene shouted, pointing toward a small convoy of trucks that had somehow managed to navigate the rough terrain around the lake without waking anyone except him. In the darkness, I could make out what appeared to be a compact excavator, several workers carrying sledgehammers and crowbars, and a figure who looked suspiciously like Miranda directing the operation from what she probably considered a safe distance. It was immediately obvious that this wasn't any kind of legitimate county action or official demolition. This was a criminal attempt to destroy the physical evidence of my family's property rights before I could use it to challenge her legal manipulations. I called 911 while Eugene called Tom Stevens, and within 20 minutes, the entire situation had transformed into something resembling an active crime scene investigation. The county sheriff's deputies arrived first, their patrol cars flashing lights, turning the peaceful lakeside into something that looked like a disaster area. Tom arrived shortly afterward with a briefcase full of legal documents and a video camera to document everything that was happening. Finally, a very sleepy and clearly irritated county building inspector named Williams arrived to verify that the demolition crew had no permits, no authorization, and no legal right to be anywhere near my property. The workers with the demolition equipment turned out to be day laborers who'd been hired through some kind of cash arrangement and had absolutely no idea they were participating in what amounted to criminal trespassing and attempted destruction of property. They'd been told they were part of an emergency county safety operation to remove a dangerous structure that posed immediate risks to public welfare. When the deputies started questioning them about who had hired them and what they'd been told about the job, it became clear that they were victims of Miranda's desperation rather than willing participants in her criminal scheme. But the real breakthrough came when the deputies began interrogating Miranda about her role in organizing the late-night demolition attempt. Under pressure from law enforcement officers who were clearly unimpressed with her explanations, she made the critical error of trying to justify her actions by claiming that county officials had given her special authorization to address immediate safety hazards that required emergency intervention. When Inspector Williams pointed out that no such authorization existed in county records, Miranda doubled down by insisting that she had exited approval from planning officials who understood the urgent nature of the community safety issues involved. That's when Miranda's entire house of cards began collapsing in spectacular fashion. The deputies contacted the county planning office's emergency number, which led to a series of phone calls that revealed what appeared to be a systematic pattern of document falsification and official corruption. It turned out that Miranda had been paying a county planning clerk to backdate approval documents and create fake paper trails for complaints that had never been properly filed or investigated. The clerk had been altering official records in the exchange for cash payments that totaled over $20,000. By sunrise, the entire conspiracy had unraveled completely. Miranda was in handcuffs, charged with criminal trespassing, attempted destruction of property, conspiracy to commit fraud, and bribery of public officials. The demolition crew was released after providing detailed statements about how they'd been deceived and manipulated, but their equipment was impounded as evidence. The corrupt county clerk was also arrested, where investigators found boxes of falsified documents and records of cash payments from Miranda dating back almost 3 years. The local newspaper treated the story like the scandal of the decade. The front-page headline read, "HOA president arrested in elaborate property fraud scheme," and the accompanying article detailed how Miranda had systematically corrupted county processes and targeted property owners who didn't conform to her vision of ideal community development. It turned out that I wasn't her first victim. Over the past 2 years, she'd successfully forced 3 other families to sell their properties and move away through similar tactics. The legal consequences for Miranda were swift and severe. In addition to the criminal charges, she faced civil lawsuits from multiple property owners who'd been affected by her schemes. Her house was listed for sale within a week of her arrest, as she desperately needed money for legal representation and to begin paying restitution to her various victims. The Lakeside Estates HOA was officially dissolved after an emergency vote by the remaining members who wanted to distance themselves completely from the scandal. The transformation of our neighborhood in the months following Miranda's arrest was remarkable and heartwarming. Rick Palmer was elected as the coordinator for a new, completely voluntary neighborhood association that focused on environmental protection and community cooperation rather than property control. Eugene Gable was officially appointed as our neighborhood watch coordinator, which basically formalized the surveillance activities he'd been conducting anyway. Betty Morrison became our unofficial community historian, helping other property owners research their land rights and understand the complex development history around the lake. As for me, I found myself in the unexpected position of being both a local hero and the owner of significantly more valuable property than I had ever imagined. The official county survey confirmed that my grandfather's 1962 property deed was completely accurate and legally binding, which meant I owned 52 acres of prime lakefront real estate. Several neighbors approached me about purchasing small portions of land to resolve their property boundary issues, which provided me with financial security I'd never experienced before. 8 months later, Tom Stevens called with the final resolution of Miranda's case. She'd been sentenced to 18 months in county jail, 3 years of probation, and ordered to pay over $75,000 in restitution to her various victims. She'd sold her house and moved to another state, presumably to start over somewhere that didn't know about her reputation as a criminal HOA president. You know what the most satisfying part is? Tom said, "The county has completely overhauled their HOA approval processes because of your case. Your experience has probably prevented dozens of other families from going through the same kind of harassment that Miranda put you through." As I hung up the phone and watched the sunset over the peaceful water, I thought about my grandfather's words about property rights and the importance of standing up for what's right. The lake was quiet again, but now I understood that real peace isn't something you achieve by avoiding conflict. It's something you earn by finding the courage to fight for what matters when it truly counts.